Hi, everyone. This is Evan Langert with the Langert Commercial Group, and I'd like to talk to you in this video about options to extend your lease term if you're a tenant. As we all know, every tenant has a lease term. Could be 3 years, could be 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. Those are most common, but they're also, especially as you get into anchor tenants and bigger box tenants and even department stores, you can have 20-year leases, 25, 30, I've even seen 50. And while you're in your primary lease term, which is what that initial term is called, you have rent that's set and you have increases that's set. If it's 3% a year, it goes up 3% every year. And during the primary term, you're obligated to occupy your premises, to pay your rent, and to abide by all the other covenants that it says in the lease that the tenant has to abide by. On the other side of the coin, a landlord is obligated by what the lease requires a landlord to do, to make repairs, do maintenance, provide certain services, unless, of course, you default and get evicted from the premises. So everything's sort of set in your primary lease term. And after that's over, if you have an option or multiple options to extend, first of all, you have to exercise them. And you have to exercise them in writing, and you typically have to exercise them in advance, most often 9 months or a year in advance. I've seen longer. I've seen 6 months. Usually, that's probably 95% of cases that I see with those particular parameters. So landlords typically want notice because they don't want to wait until the last week or the last month of your lease term and then find out, whoops, I'm not exercising my option to extend. I'm going to close down and move over across the street. If that happens, the landlord hasn't marketed or advertised the space, and they're way behind the 8 ball when it comes to getting a new tenant in there after you leave. So again, they require written notice fairly far in advance as to whether you're going to exercise your option or not. And if you don't meet that date, you lose the right to exercise your option. So be careful. If you've got a tickler file on your computer or whatever they're called in these computer days, mark that date as to when you have to exercise your option. I've seen many tenants miss them and then want to exercise an option and find out they don't have the ability to do that. Now, one other thing about options is that they're typically at market rates. And if you have, especially a long-term lease where you've gone up 3% a year, and you've had any kind of period of inflation or even hyperinflation during your lease term, most often market rates are significantly higher than what you've been paying during the last term of your lease. So when you get into your option period, you might experience a great increase in the amount of base rent that you're paying. Now, there are down cycles during lease terms, and sometimes it so happens that at the end of your lease term, you end up paying less during your option. But way more often, from my experience, and we're talking 3 decades plus, you end up paying more at the end of your lease term, especially if you've had a longer lease term. I would say 98% of options that I've seen are at market. And so what does the clause say? Well, most typically, a landlord standard clause says that you have the right to extend the lease for a 5-year term or extension option, or maybe you've got 2 consecutive rights to do that at market rent. And then it says the parties will determine what market rent is. And if they can't determine what market rent is, then the tenant loses the option. If you're a tenant, you don't want that language in the lease because many times before, landlords have spouted out a number that's far in excess of what market really is and said that's the number if you want to exercise your option to extend. And you as a tenant say, no, it's not that high number, it's this number down here. And the landlord won't agree. And you either don't have your option or you get to go to court to fight the landlord over whether they properly denied your option or whether it was properly defeated. So what I typically do is something that we call sometimes baseball arbitration. Sometimes we call it the 3 brokers or the 3 appraisers rule. And so what happens under this scenario is once an option's exercised, landlord and tenant have a certain period of time where they can determine market rent. If they can't or don't determine market rent in that period of time, the landlord chooses whether an appraiser or a broker, somebody with, say, 5 years experience in looking at retail leases, or in the case of an office lease, office leases in that particular market. Each party chooses one, and those two brokers, and I prefer brokers because appraisers typically charge, brokers typically don't for this kind of service, or at least they're less expensive. And those two brokers or appraisers get together for a period of time and attempt to determine the market rent for the premises for the option term. Now, in the event that these two parties can't come up with a number or agree on a number, which frankly I've never seen happen during my career, but I'm sure it's happened out there, then those two brokers or appraisers pick another broker or appraiser in the case of appraisers, and that party should not have worked with the landlord or the tenant before and should not have any bias, and they should have at least the experience in the market that the other brokers or appraisers have. And that party is actually given the power to determine the market rent for the option period. So if you have a naked option, I call the first one, where it's just the landlord gives you a number and you disagree, and if you can't agree with the landlord, then the option's gone. I prefer the three brokers method. I think it's fair. As always in these videos, I make no representation of giving any specific legal or brokerage advice to any particular tenant or in any particular situation. This is just general knowledge so that you understand that these terms are out there and how sometimes they're dealt with. If you want to talk about your specific situation or perhaps engage me as your broker, also, again, I'm a very experienced commercial leasing attorney. I could potentially be hired to negotiate your lease as an attorney. Give me a call. I'm at 443-529-0505. That's 443-529-0505. I can also be reached via email at elangert@thelangertgroup.com. Again, that's elangert@thelangertgroup.com. And Langert is ELANGERT. Have a great day, and God bless.